HOA blocked my driveway farm with 3 bulldozers, unaware I own the entire county. David stood his ground as the HOA lady pointed furiously at the bulldozers. "You're trespassing," she barked, her hands slicing through the air. But David just smirked. She had no idea who she was messing with. She thought she had power. He had the law. Watch till the end to see the twist she never saw coming. The sun had barely risen when David Parker heard the deep rumbling outside his farmhouse. He grabbed his coffee, took a slow sip, and walked to his front porch. His land stretched far and wide, acres of open fields, the old barn, and his driveway, a private road leading straight to the main street. But what he saw made his blood run cold. 3 massive bulldozers stood at the edge of his property, engines roaring. A group of men in neon vests and hard hats hovered nearby, chatting as if they weren't about to destroy years of hard work. And in the middle of it all, arms crossed, was Cynthia Holloway, the HOA president. Her expensive suit and smug expression told him everything he needed to know. David stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "What's going on here?" Cynthia turned with a satisfied smirk. "Oh, Mr. Parker. Glad you finally decided to wake up. Your so-called farm violates HOA regulations. It's an eyesore to the community, and frankly, we're tired of it. So, we're clearing it out. You should have removed it yourself." David let out a slow breath. "You can't just bulldoze my land. That driveway is private property. You have no right." "Oh, but we do," Cynthia interrupted, waving a folder in his face. "According to the latest HOA zoning laws, your driveway extends into what is now considered community land. And since you refuse to comply with our demands, we've taken matters into our own hands. It's all perfectly legal." David took the folder and skimmed through the pages. His eyes narrowed. She was confident, too confident. And that meant one thing: she hadn't done her homework. He looked up, his tone sharp. "You really think you can get away with this?" Cynthia laughed, motioning to the bulldozers. "Oh, sweetheart, we already have." The operators climbed into their machines, engines revving louder. David stood still, heart pounding, but not from fear. From anticipation. They had no idea what they were walking into. Because what Cynthia and the HOA didn't know was that David Parker didn't just own the driveway. He owned the entire county. David stood motionless, watching as the first bulldozer inched forward, its massive steel blade scraping against the gravel of his driveway. The HOA board members stood behind Cynthia, arms crossed, looking pleased with themselves. The confidence in their eyes made David chuckle under his breath. They had no idea. He pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and raised it to his ear. "Yeah, it's happening. Let them dig their own graves." Then, without another word, he hung up. Cynthia smirked. "Calling for backup, Mr. Parker? Hate to break it to you, but the sheriff is on our side." David didn't even flinch. He turned his attention to the bulldozer operators. "I wouldn't take another step forward if I were you." The lead operator hesitated. "Ma'am, are we sure about this?" Cynthia snapped, "Do it." The bulldozer lunged forward, plowing deep into the gravel. And just like that, the trap was set. David stepped back, arms crossed, waiting. Not 5 seconds later, the blaring sound of sirens cut through the air. Red and blue lights flashed as multiple county police vehicles sped down the road, tires screeching to a stop. Cynthia's smirk faltered. "What the?" From the first patrol car, Sheriff Lawson stepped out, face grim. His eyes swept the scene before landing on David. "Parker, what's going on here?" David barely held back his grin. "Glad you could make it, Sheriff. We've got a trespassing issue." Cynthia scoffed. "Excuse me? This is an HOA matter." "Not anymore," Lawson cut her off, pulling out a thick folder. "David Parker isn't just a homeowner. He's the primary landowner of this entire county. Every inch of property your bulldozers just tore into? That's county land. And let me remind you, destroying county property is a felony. Dead silence. Cynthia's face drained of color. That can't be right. Lawson didn't even blink. It's right. I suggest you step away from the equipment before you rack up more charges. The bulldozer operators scrambled down from their seats, hands up. The HOA board members shifted nervously. But David wasn't done. He pulled a rolled-up document from his back pocket and slowly unrolled it. Oh, and one more thing, he said, enjoying the panic settling into Cynthia's face. This here? It's a cease and desist order. Filed 2 weeks ago. You just violated it on record. He turned his phone around. The screen was still recording. Cynthia's expression twisted into something ugly. I'd be careful with your next words, David warned. Because you just gave me everything I need to take the HOA to court. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The fight was slipping from her eyes. The sirens. The cops. The legal trap she had just walked into. David stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. You thought you owned me. Turns out, you just bulldozed into your own grave. Cynthia's hands clenched into fists. But there was nothing left to say. The sheriff turned to his deputies. Arrest anyone who refuses to leave. This property is under legal protection. David took a slow sip of his now-cold coffee, watching as the HOA's power crumbled right in front of him. And he was just getting started. Cynthia's breathing turned shallow as she watched her empire collapse in real time. The HOA board members, once standing tall behind her, had started backing away, whispering among themselves, realizing they had followed her straight into a legal disaster. David exhaled slowly, taking in the chaos around him. The deputies were already handing out warnings, marking names for official reports. A few board members were arguing, trying to distance themselves from Cynthia, while the bulldozer operators, clearly wanting no part of this mess, were already packing up their equipment. But David wasn't done yet. Not even close. He took a step toward Cynthia, his voice low and calm. You didn't just trespass today. You didn't just destroy private property. You knowingly violated a cease and desist order. You tried to take something that was never yours to begin with. Cynthia's face twisted in fury. This is a misunderstanding. We have legal rights. The HOA Charter. David let out a short laugh. The HOA Charter? You mean the one that only applies within your tiny little subdivision? He gestured around them. This isn't HOA land, sweetheart. This is county property. Which, I remind you, I own. Cynthia looked at the sheriff in desperation. You can't let him get away with this. The HOA has power here. Sheriff Lawson didn't even blink. Not anymore. He lifted the folder in his hands. This is a full investigative report on the HOA's activities. Over 20 complaints filed against you in the last year alone, illegal fines, forged documents, fraudulent property seizures. And this little stunt of yours today? This is the final nail in the coffin. David raised his eyebrows. You really should have checked the ownership records before bringing in the bulldozers. But I guess reading wasn't your strong suit. The sheriff's deputy walked up, handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. Ma'am, you're under arrest for destruction of private property, unlawful seizure, and multiple counts of fraud. Cynthia's eyes went wild. You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. The deputy didn't even hesitate. Not anymore, you're not. The moment the cuffs clicked around Cynthia's wrists, a murmur spread through the gathered crowd. Homeowners from the neighborhood, people who had suffered under the HOA's rule, stood at the edge of David's property, watching the downfall unfold. Some pulled out their phones, recording every second. Others started whispering, their expressions shifting from fear to satisfaction. And then, someone clapped. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted in cheers. People whistled, clapped, and even laughed as Cynthia was escorted toward the police car, screaming the entire way. David leaned against his truck, watching with quiet amusement. This wasn't just about his land anymore. This was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied, overcharged, and threatened by an overreaching HOA. And Cynthia? She had just become the perfect example of what happens when you try to take on the wrong man. But David still wasn't done. Because the real revenge? That was still coming. As the police car carrying Cynthia disappeared down the road, David turned to the crowd gathering on his land. The homeowners, his neighbors, many of whom had suffered under the HOA's rule, looked at him with something new in their eyes. Hope. A man in a flannel shirt stepped forward. Is it true? She's really gone. David smirked. Oh, she's gone, all right. But we're not finished yet. A murmur spread through the group. People exchanged glances, the weight of years of frustration lifting from their shoulders. Some of them had been fined over nonsense, mailboxes that weren't the right shade of beige, grass that was half an inch too tall, holiday decorations removed at HOA's command. The stories were endless. David pulled his phone out of his pocket, scrolled through his contacts, and pressed a button. He turned the speaker on, letting the crowd hear the first ring. Then a second. Finally, a voice answered. Mr. Parker, I was just about to call you. I assume you've seen the news. David grinned. I've seen it. And I think it's time we move forward with the lawsuit. The crowd gasped. Some of them clapped again, others covered their mouths in shock. The voice on the other end continued. We've got everything we need. Financial records, fraudulent contracts, even homeowners who are willing to testify. This HOA isn't just going to lose power, it's going to be dissolved. David's grin widened. Perfect. He ended the call and turned to the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, the HOA isn't just losing Cynthia. They're losing everything. We're taking them to court. A roar of approval erupted from the people around him. Some started hugging each other. Others shook David's hand. But one woman, an older lady with silver hair, wiped a tear from her eye. David, I've lived under their rules for 15 years. I thought they were untouchable. David's voice softened. That's what they wanted you to think. But the truth is, HOA power only lasts as long as people let it. At that moment, a car rolled up, a black SUV with tinted windows. The door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. The HOA's lawyer. He adjusted his tie, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. Mr. Parker, let's not be hasty. We can discuss a settlement. David tilted his head. Oh? Now you want to talk? The lawyer swallowed. I think we can come to an understanding. David chuckled. We already have an understanding. Your client is corrupt. Your HOA is finished. And I'm going to make sure everyone in this county sees it happen. The lawyer opened his mouth, but David held up a hand. You see, the funny thing about trying to steal land from someone, he stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough for the lawyer to hear. You should probably check if they own the courthouse too. The lawyer paled. David patted him on the shoulder and walked away, the cheers of his neighbors following behind him. HOA had played their game. But they never realized they were playing on his land. And now? He was taking it all back.